Gentlemen, welcome to the show. It's the first time we've had a Nobel laureate on non-beta alpha, and we appreciate you guys coming on. You guys are working on some very important matters for the future, not only of the country, but for the world. You guys are experts looking at antivirals as a new form of treatment for COVID and all the variants that are coming. And I think most of the focus in the media hype has been on the vaccines and the vaccine rollout. But as we all know, as the virus continues to mutate, the variants are going to become either more lethal or more intelligent and working around the vaccines. And so maybe we can start a little bit today about talking about what are antivirals and how do they differ from vaccines?
I guess I could start by just saying they're very different, first of all, just for the layman out there. But antivirals actually have fairly short history. The first antivirals were actually discovered in the early 60s, whereas vaccines have been around for centuries, actually. It started in the late 1700s. So certainly they've had a large jump on antivirals overall. Antivirals typically attack or slow down the propagation of the virus directly. So they normally target genes that are actually expressed or proteins that are made by the virus. So you'll hear stories of drugs that affect the polymerase or the proteases that the virus actually make. Vaccines, on the other hand, are more using the host defenses, the naturally defense of the host through the immune system. And what you're basically doing is priming the immune system against the virus of interest. And so they're very effective. The procedure is very effective. But there is this problem that if variants arise in whatever the antigen is for that immune response, you could evade the vaccine and then you're back with a problem again. So I think the best solution, and Lee can certainly chime in on this, is a combination of both. So vaccines to be prepared for, to basically allow the immune system to be prepared for that virus when it infects. But the problem still exists that if you're infected, even in the presence of a vaccine, you still need something to treat it. And antivirals would be the answer for that, hopefully.
And a question for both of you is, so antivirals is a little bit newer technology, but it doesn't seem to have had the historic funding. Can you talk a little bit about the history of funding antivirals and maybe what we need to look at in the future to continue to make R&D gains in this space?
With regard, not so much to funding, I'll let maybe Gennaro can handle that. But I think one other thing that's worth saying is that we have a very dramatic and successful history of antivirals with HIV/AIDS virus, where vaccines have not been effective. And we now control HIV so that people who are infected remain infected their entire lives, but live a normal lifespan because of antiviral agents.
And so a lot of these antivirals, they just didn't get the news, but there's a few that some doctors and some people were saying that that we're making progress in terms of treatment when people went to the hospital. Can you talk, just we take a step back and talk about March 2020 from your perspective, what happened, and then how maybe the data wasn't great, maybe the approach wasn't perfect. Like, what could have we done differently as a healthcare infrastructure to better protect citizens around the world?
Yeah, I think I can take a stab at this one. And it sort of will relate back to your previous question as well. The bottom line is there's not much incentive to make antivirals in the pharmaceutical industry. It's not something that's considered a very lucrative market unless something like this happens. So that's a big reason why there's not been a huge push on the creation of novel antivirals. So there's very few, to be honest. But I think at the time March happened, 2020, April 2020, the reality is that any drug that needs to go into a person has to be convincingly shown that it has an effect, has efficacy. And the way you normally do that is through randomized placebo-controlled trials. And even if you see some anecdotal evidence that a drug might be working, and prime example of that was hydroxychloroquine, until you actually prove it out in a proper trial, you really can't say that it's definitive. And it can be dangerous if it's not tested properly. So there's been a lot of talk of certain antiviral treatments, but the other big problem is no one really knows how they work. So it's basically somebody tried something and it seemed to work, and now you have to prove it. And I think there was just so much of that going on, and it's so expensive to do clinical trials that's the biggest problem. So how do we circumvent all that? Well, obviously to think ahead. And I just told you the pharma companies won't think ahead and they won't develop antivirals typically, and that's still the case. So I think the government or the public has to really get behind an effort to stockpile antivirals prior to pandemics occurring. And to be honest, there's a lot of viruses we know a lot about, and we can actually develop these drugs a priori so that everybody can have a drug available if something like this happens, at least to knock down the proliferation of these viruses. And it doesn't have to be specific to that virus. We can look for host-directed, broad spectrum antivirals. And that's, I think, where we really need to put our emphasis.
Yeah, I mean, and it seems that these aren't that expensive to mass produce once you find, several cocktails that work. But the economic externality of not having these available and having to go through another forced shutdown like we did in 2020, I mean, it cost the global economy trillions and trillions of dollars. Lost livelihoods, companies went bankrupt. And so it seems like a small price to pay for the global leaders to invest in this technology and prepare. Do you see future pandemics? Do you see they're going to happen more frequently in the future? What is your outlook for these types of occurrences in the future?
Lee, you want to make a comment on that? I'm sure you have an opinion.
I think we have no way of predicting these things. It's like a lot of other existential threats to humanity. You have to prepare as best you can for things are a risk, but these are primarily viruses that come from other animals in the wild. And so to the extent that we can control it, we would have to control human interaction with wild animals.
And as globalization marches on, people are moving to more urban, denser areas in Africa and Asia. The mega cities are being developed, and so that concentration between people and animals is going to only continue to become more of an issue. So as it relates to antivirals, though, it's a different approach. The vaccine actually attacks a specific virus or variant. The antiviral is more attacking or changing the host. Can you talk a little bit about what that means?
Absolutely. Certainly a passion of mine at the moment, because I think most of the emphasis over the last several years or even decades has been focused on attacking the virus, looking for and really avoiding things that affected the host. But what we've learned in the last year, and to be honest, this year was very informative because we found out that viruses are actually dependent upon host metabolism in a way that is not really all that surprising, to be honest. And we never really looked at that as a direct way to block viral propagation. And the other aspect of this, I think is extremely important, is when we did our work, we focused on the mortality rather than the virus. We were looking more at how we could affect mortality of patients, because we felt that was the most important thing. You could get infected and your immune system can ultimately take care of the virus. But what we found out in the course of these studies is that the virus actually impacts the host cell and changes the metabolism of the cell to benefit its propagation. And so we did an unbiased screening. We found out that drugs were effective at reducing viral propagation or actually affecting the host cell in a way to decrease metabolism. So we now know that there's an avenue here that's really unique and is not going to be affected by variants, we believe. We have to show that definitively, but we believe that that's the case. And it is directing the medications towards the host. Now, why is that exciting? Is because we have 10,000 approved medications that affect the host. And most likely, many of those medications may have a very useful application for this disease and other diseases for that matter. And now we have a way, using our methodology we created to actually address that head on and find those drugs. But it's going to take a commitment from government or the public to do this. And I think, like you said before, it's a small commitment compared to what the effect of having a pandemic is.
Well, back in Q2 of 2020, government leaders had multiple strategies, lockdown, social distancing, wearing masks, putting all their eggs in the vaccine basket. Where did the intellectual argument break down between Operation Warp Speed, the pharmaceutical industry, and just science to not put a dual track effort on antivirals? It seems like we're just now getting started on the antiviral track.
I think it largely has to do with the decisions of pharmaceutical companies, because they control the production of these drugs, and we didn't have anything stockpiled that worked. So vaccines were a quick way to make money, to be honest, and to actually have a positive effect on the virus. To have a vaccine is great. There's no denying that. I think the problem with the antivirals is that we had no concerted effort to find them prior to the pandemic. And so now it was a race to see if we could figure out how to do clinical trials and discovery within a year, which is virtually impossible. So Lee and I had the approach to say, we already have the drugs out there. We need to find a way to address that. And I think we successfully did that. And so now we have candidate drugs, but we still have the problem. We have to test them. So I think we need to do this a priority. We have to prepare ourselves prior to pandemics. And this is the plan we're trying to put forward now, Lee and I. So I think that's the problem. There's just no incentive really for the industries that make drugs to do this in such a short amount of time.
Well, I would say too that it wasn't really a failure on anybody's part, government or pharma. Once a new pathogen arises, the timeline to create drugs against the pathogen is typically several years. And so you have to do a lot of fundamental studies to identify potential targets in the pathogen. You can't use things you knew previously. You have to go after that particular virus, find drugs that affect it, and do clinical trials with them. And it's a several year, billion-dollar process. The difference here is that we believe there are existing drugs already proven safe in human clinical trials, which can solve this problem because they act on the host rather than the virus, and you don't need to do that several years of fundamental research.
No, it's fascinating. And the approach that Genetic Networks has taken is you guys are looking at all the pre-approved universe of drugs, some 8,000 to 10,000 drugs that already exist, that we know they're safe for humans. The FDA is already approved. And so talk to me a little bit about how you guys approach looking at those drugs and their impact on viruses like coronavirus.
Yeah, so we developed at Genetic Networks a program we call the Sentinel Paradigm. And the way we approach this is, simple at a high level. It's to take all these drugs that are available, and we've screened many of them. We have not screened all 10,000, but we have screened thousands of compounds, and some of those are FDA approved. And we look to see how those drugs work in the context of the entire cell. And we basically use yeast, which is an incredibly powerful system that can be easily manipulated to do these kinds of experiments. And they have direct relevance to human biology, which is really fantastic. And so the concept here is that if we could understand how each and every one of those drugs works in the context of the genome, basically what genes are important for their activity, we build signatures for each one of those drugs. And the simple truth is, when we found a drug in the literature that was reducing mortality of patients that were infected with COVID-19 and had been treated with one of these drugs we identified, we got immediately the modular signature, let's say, for that drug. And that led to identifying 13 additional drugs in our database of thousands of compounds. And 10 of those immediately were active against the virus, but they were all directed to the host. So our approach right now is working at some level, but to be honest, we want to scale it because we've gotten the proof of principle now that this is a fast way to do this, but we need to screen all the approved medications of the world in order to actually have a wider breadth of knowledge about what is really available out there. And I think a common problem is that people don't know what the drugs that they're saying work, how they work yet. So that's sort of the general approach.
And so all these compounds, you guys are basically creating a signature, a chemical signature, or a library of effects that they have on different chemical reactions or organic reactions. Is that
cellular reactions? We call it cellular intelligence because we use the cell to give the readout, and it's unbiased. So we don't go in with any preconceived notion of what should work. We ask the simple question of what does work in human, and then give it a signature using yeast, which we can use through machine learning and other techniques for how we can bring this forward in identifying additional drugs. So it's an iterative process within our database that generates the best candidates. And we've had an incredible hit rate for things that are active, not only against the virus, but also about how does the virus interact with the cell? And what are the things that lead to, let's say, the cytokine storm that people talk about, the immune response that is actually hurting people the most? We've actually uncovered mechanisms that we think are involved there. And our approach was able to identify drugs that may be effective in that type of cascade, if you will. So that's sort of the general approach. And I think it's important to get the word out on this because it is an approach that can be used for preparation, could be used for being prepared for the next pandemic. And again, it's a fraction of what economically we can lose if another one was to come.
From a sort of fundamental biology perspective, that what we've gained some insight into in yeast, and I mean the broad scientific community has gained insight into, is that the cell is organized into teams of proteins. And we know a little about these from basic biochemistry, from cellular pathways and structures in the cell. But it turns out that these teams are made up of anywhere from 30 to 100 proteins. And we don't know what those members are yet from basic science principles. But with yeast, we can use genetic approaches to interrogate each gene in the cell. The cell has about 7,000 genes. And looking at combination effects, we can discover these modules of 30 to 100 proteins and learn that a particular drug affects not only a single protein target in the cell, but the larger module around that protein. And so those are sort of our sentinel ideas, is that within the cell, there's maybe 100 to 200 modules that can be influenced by drugs acting on a variety of different targets.
Interesting. And so, and not to go too far into the weeds on this, but so you're basically looking at a bunch of different combinations in a simple cellular structure of how these chemicals interact with that cellular structure to get to the potential outcome if you were to then take it to a more complex system like a human cell. The question is, do you guys use machine learning or AI to go through the different permutations of the compound interactions, or are these all that have to be experimental and watched and measured?
I think what's unique about the technology is that it's based on a wet lab experimentation protocol that is proprietary to the company, but has been developed over literally about a decade or so, where we've worked on these concepts that Lee first put forward so many years ago, actually, on modular biology. And so that's been sort of where I built my career. I spent my entire scientific career studying modular biology. And we now are just getting to the point, I wouldn't call it AI because I think that's an overused term, to be perfectly honest. But I would say we are currently working on using machine learning techniques, which are outside of my area of expertise, but I have hired a very good computational biologist named Chris McCary, who's been working on using machine learning with the data we collect. And every experiment with a drug yields about 18,000 points of measure that we now, if we start doing this at scale, which you can imagine doing the math of 10,000 drugs times 18,000 points of reference, it gets pretty formidable. And so he is actually applying not only his great biological skills in terms of thinking and theoretizing about how these modulars work, but also how we can make the best map of those drugs that can be then used and correlated to phenotypes that we want or changes in health that we want. And I think it's going to be very powerful to find pre-existing drugs, as Lee pointed out, that are really effective at treating patients with all sorts of diseases, not just pandemics, but any disease. And it might be a real game changer in terms of how the industry reacts to that. So I think it will make them more innovative personally, but that's my own bias there. But that's the approach. I mean, we do use machine learning to just be a short answer to your question.
I think we were all blessed that this wasn't a more fatal, and the mortality rate was as low as it was. I think a lot of the uncertainty in the markets and the economy and from the leadership was we just didn't know how bad it was going to get from a mortality rate perspective. At what point did you guys realize, or did your industry realize that this was a treatable, disease, or it was more about the comorbidities? When did you guys become more relieved that this was not as dangerous as a virus like, say, MERS or Ebola?
Well, I'm not even sure I'm completely relieved yet, to be perfectly honest. I don't know how Lee feels about that, but I think there's still a very strong risk here. But I think it was almost an opportunity for us when it happened in March, because a company had done quite well, but it was an opportunity to rapidly deploy our efforts towards the problem. And I always felt very strongly that host-directed antivirals we had evidence for that many years ago from some of the work we had done, that this was a really legitimate way to go. This was just a way to prove it. The bottom line was, when you have all the eyes on something like this, it's a lot easier to try to push forward and show people what you can do here. So I think it's treatable. I think there are ways to slow it down and make it a common cold. I think that's really the objective I have as a person, as a team. I think at Genetic Networks, we all feel the same. We're not talking about eradicating the virus, because I think the real problem here is the infection causes this massive inflammation, depending on viral load, probably. And if we could reduce the viral load and at the same time reduce the inflammation, I think we can really have a major effect on mortality, which is really the ultimate reason people are nervous and scared to go outside, because they don't want to die from this virus. And I think that's where and Lee, I think, probably agrees with me, that's where the emphasis should be put, on finding an oral broad spectrum agent that can help reduce the severity of the disease if you are so unfortunate as to catch it. So you want to add anything, Lee?
Yeah, I think I agree with Gennaro. We're not out of the woods by any means. Here in Washington State, we're entering our fourth wave. And, we're all hoping that the vaccines will be used broadly enough to confer some kind of herd immunity. But the threat of a resistant virus is ever present and could be disastrous, could continue for another year or more. So the thing that's important to recognize about targeting the host rather than the virus is that the virus can't mutate around a host target. So the anti-host drug is likely to take care of the problem for any viral variants. We won't have to worry about that.
And you guys mentioned inflammation being one of the issues that is really hurting people who have dysfunctional immune systems. And a lot of people were talking about supplements, right? I was taking D3, zinc, vitamin C. Did those help? And is that part of the cocktail in the future? And is that good for just general health in particular, or is there something about that cocktail that everybody was talking about, doctors were prescribing to help us just as a population stay healthier? Should we continue after this is over taking these types of supplements?
Well, I don't think people really know that yet, but I want to just say one small change to what you said is that people have this problem with the inflammation and immune responses, not because they have a bad immune system. It could happen in young people, of course, because they have an overly active immune system. And so that's why I pointed out that knocking out the virus is pretty easy, actually. The immune system will take care of that. But the problem, we believe, is that the virus actually increases host factors that lead to the inflammation, that leads to the cytokine storm. So the infection is responsible, and you have to quiet that down. So it's actually, you have to reduce the immune response in the individual. And there's good evidence for that, like dexamethasone is something that's shown to work in that regard, at least in some patients. But I don't think we all want to be taking steroids all the time. So what we're working on are safe drugs. It's a key feature that the drugs we're trying to identify are safe. These are drugs that are intended to be used chronically. So I think that's a really big potential breakthrough, because that's something you could take even prophylactically, potentially, during a time of the pandemic. So I think that you're right in saying that inflammation is really the culprit here for ending someone's life or making them very, very sick. We need things that do both, I think. Combinations will probably be very important. And in fact, some of the drugs we've identified look like they might have antiviral activity as well as anti-inflammatory activity. And that's very exciting, because it would be great to have something like that in a single safe pill. So those are things to consider. We have a lot to learn still about this virus, about how it causes these problems. I think that we are continually learning more. But I think that right now is the time to find out what we have on the shelf that can be used.
With regard to supplements too, the only way you know whether they're effective or not is to do a large clinical trial where you compare people who are on supplements to people who aren't. And to the extent that there have been clinical trials performed, and often they're just not big enough, but things like vitamin D and zinc and other things have been looked at. And there hasn't been found anything that is highly effective against this virus.
Mm-hmm.
Except
let me ask a different question.
In people who are already sick.
Yeah.
Well, one concept that has been floated around is that this virus attacks different populations or different racial groups differently. Is there any truth to that? Is there a certain genotype or phenotype that really is worse suited? Because one school of thought is it's about comorbidity, it's about being obese, or is there genetic predisposition to having this virus attack you in a different way?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think Lee remembers when March, April came around and we did our work, we found a mode of action, we call it, that was a target potentially for antivirals or at least anti-mortality, let's put it, and it had to do with lipid metabolism, and immediately I said, wow, we should be looking at patients that are vulnerable and have excess lipid. And it turned out that about 8 months later, we saw some retrospective studies coming out showing, of course, the obesity was the first. And then there was actually one that I saw on NASH, a very common, affects about 15% of the population worldwide, pretty much. It affects liver, right? It's called fatty liver disease. And that was really telling, I think. So yes, I think it's not, obviously socioeconomic issues are always at play. People are not healthy, they're not eating well, whatever. That's always going to lead to more complications if you get infected. That's a given. But I think the other aspect of this, which is really important, is patients that have underlying illnesses like diabetes, obesity, and NASH perhaps are really vulnerable to this disease because we have a hypothesis that the virus likes lipids. And so if you have a lot of lipids, it might be a really nice place to go infect and grow. So if we all went on perfect diets or whatever, maybe we'd reduce the mortality quite a bit, but that's pretty hard to do, as you know, so to get people to change their ways.
And with regard to this question of, genetic susceptibility, with the exception of very rare diseases, there's been a lot of work done on common diseases and susceptibility to various kinds of things. And there's always huge numbers of factors involved, both environmental and genetic. And you can sort of make a broad statement that roughly, 50% of the susceptibility to anything is genetic and 50% of it's environmental in some way. And on both sides, there are multiple conditions.
Yeah, that's right.
So we're complex. We live in a complex world.
No, that's a fair statement. And, the comment on lipids, I think it's something that everybody can do. And I tell our employees and advisors here that, we're probably all going to catch this at some point. You just want to make sure you've got your best foot forward to combat it and, get your BMI under 30 and try to eat healthier. And, if your hypothesis is right that lipids are the main kind of vector here for the virus to be successful at creating this inflammation in the storm, then it's something that we can all do, just eat better, stop going to McDonald's, and try to change our lipid content in our blood.
Indeed. It can't hurt.
It can't hurt.
There's no evidence that it will help either.
Well, I was joking with a friend that it's all the people that I know that had mild symptoms all drink bourbon. So, there's a hypothesis for every lifestyle, I guess.
Right.
Can you send me some of that bourbon, please? No, just
Absolutely. Well, so, as it relates to the next step in the future here, what are governments doing in Europe, in the U.S., maybe the Western democracies? Are we collaborating properly? Should we be doing it better in terms of sharing science? And then from a scientist's perspective, has China been forthcoming with their data? I heard a comment from a healthcare expert recently that China mapped the genome of the virus, and I think Moderna had, at least the first draft of the virus done in January 2020. How has the data sharing and the dialogue in the scientific community been going, in your opinion?
Well, I can address this from my perspective. I have not dealt with data of that type because I don't build vaccines, but from our perspective, we've had a fantastic interaction with Canada, actually. I happen to have a couple of Canadians on my board, so it's kind of nice. I've always appreciated working with Canadians, but there's a very good group in Montreal and Quebec City who we've built a relationship now, and they do clinical trials in COVID, and they do preclinical work with a BL3 facility for viruses. And so from my perspective, I opened up the horizon right away because I felt, this is a global problem. This isn't a domestic problem. So I've been talking to England, I've been talking to a number of countries, but the most interactive, I would say, and the most useful has been the one with Canada. And so we're currently working together on this. So I think it's absolutely an international issue that needs to be addressed by all governments. Japan was another country we've talked to as well. So because there are great drugs in Japan, for example. They have amazing chemical labs there, but they don't really have a lot of money to necessarily bring those things forward as drugs. So I think opening up the doors to those discussions would make a lot of sense. And we've already started that process with Canada. And I think it is a concerted effort because there's not that many BL3 labs actually for pandemics specifically. There's not a lot of BL3 facilities to do experiments. And so really we want to open up those relationships. Yeah.
But on a global scale, the sharing of scientific information has been incredibly open and rapid worldwide. Lots of information coming out pre-publication and being shared widely. So the scientific community, I think, is working very effectively, as rapidly as it can, to collaborate globally.
Yeah, that's very true.
And so with that being said, so if you're a layman looking at what happened in the last 12 months, it basically, with all of our best and brightest, huge amounts of resources, it took us about a year to at least get a strategy in place to really combat this virus. And so in future pandemics, Do you think that it's going to take us a year to get our house in order, to get our approach in order? Or did we learn a lot? And is this a dawn of a new era as it relates to combating viruses and outbreaks?
I would hope we learned a very important lesson this year, and we'd stockpile on the things that are necessary to prevent something like this again, which of course includes masks and gloves and things of that nature for the hospitals that need them. But I also strongly believe that if we put a strong effort in identifying an antiviral or combination of antivirals to protect from Ebola, MERS, SARS, all the different viruses that could potentially spring up, and have something more broad spectrum, those theoretically could be stockpiled and ready to be deployed immediately upon an event occurring. And I think we just didn't have that this year. Tamiflu is a good example of something like that. It's extremely effective flu medication if given very early, but it's something that's stockpiled for very specific virus. And so it wasn't useful here. But that's the concept, right? You stockpile the medication so that if something like this happens again, you can have a quick channel to get those medications to people that need them, ideally oral, so it's easy to take. So that's the goal. I think if people wake up to that and make it happen, that would be a great thing.
But one thing I think we're really struggling with globally is really the types of governments and how they can deal with this issue. With any kind of infectious disease, there are good ways to control it, which have to do with identifying infected people quickly. That means massive testing, contact tracing, forced quarantines and closures of travel and things like that. And to the extent that these can be imposed upon a population, they can be effective. And here we see the difficulty of different kinds of governments. So China has been very effective. Taiwan has been very effective in controlling the spread of the disease. And Europe and the United States have been very ineffective because we cannot impose the kind of control. We cannot do the kind of surveillance of information that's needed to really control something. So there's a big open question for all countries in terms of protecting individual privacy versus protecting individual health.
I think we've seen that in Canada too recently with the new laws passed. I mean, it seems the Canadians value security or this, healthcare stability versus individual liberty and freedom. And to your point about China and Iran getting it under control faster, it's a very interesting question philosophically for governments. Here in Texas, you couldn't tell Texans to stay home. They just weren't going to have any of it. And you see the 50 different democracy, experiments we have in all of our different states with different approaches. It's been fascinating to see these different approaches play out. So the vaccine strategy, the rollout, that's kind of end of the first chapter. It seems there will be a gap in this vaccine strategy. That's why they're talking about boosters and maybe new vaccines in the future. You mentioned earlier that these antivirals have to go through human trials. Where are we in that process? Are there any in human trials right now, and which country is leading the way in antiviral trials?
Yeah, so I can give you a quick update for what I know. So I know there are quite a few trials obviously going on. I think they're in the thousands, to be honest. But I think the ones that are mostly mainstream are very few. So NIH put together ACTIVE, which is a program to get trials started. Very good trials, in other words, well organized, and the protocol should be very robust. I know they haven't started a lot of small molecule treatments. They did a lot of monoclonals early on. I think there's some talk of doing a few currently. I know from my perspective, 3 of the compounds we identified in our screening are now in clinical trials for COVID-19. So that's interesting to us because we're really curious to see what the outcome of those trials will be, but I have no reason to think they're going to work great yet. We just have to see. So there's here and there's a lot of trials. Some of them are poorly designed, so they may not be very helpful once completed. But there are a few that I think are very well designed, but we haven't had the results back. So the process is long and slow. It takes about a year before you get results back from a clinical trial. So, and some of those clinical trials are just getting started now, which is, I think, in a way, a little bit sad, but it's the best we could do at the time. So, so now I think there's one that showed some promise up in Canada, the group we're working with. That is going to finish very soon. The interim data look reasonable, but again, these are ongoing trials that will only be really documented probably in another few months. So maybe this summer, but we would love to start a few more, to be honest. I think we'll need more trials to really get this done.
You know, one big trend that I think awoke in the United States during the pandemic was this just-in-time inventory that we've been living in under globalization. And now we're migrating or pivoting to like just-in-case supply chain infrastructure. From your perspective, you know, what should we do as a country to nearshore the pharmaceutical industry back from India and China? You know, Senator Rubio just put out this week a bill to block pharma companies from outsourcing critical, you know, needs in infrastructure to China and going to Puerto Rico instead. What are your thoughts about how we should be approaching this?
Well, Lee, do you have a thought about that?
I don't. I think it's such a complicated issue that depends on so many factors and even personalities and attitudes and things. It makes very good sense to be as self-sufficient as possible for you know, items that can be needed in an emergency. On the other hand, it makes a great deal of sense to function in a global economy where labor is divided along specialties and people share. The global economy has been extremely effective in raising people's standards of living over the last decade or two. So, you know, we got to have both. And I think excessive protectionism is a bad idea. And excessive you know, lack of self-sufficiency is also a bad idea. There's some middle ground there.
Has the FDA approval process learned to modify itself in times of pandemic, or do you think, you know, when this calms down, we'll go back to a much prolonged process of, you know, trials?
That's a really good question. I mean, obviously they move very, very quickly when they want to. So remdesivir, of course, was a good example of that. That was moved through from a phase 2, phase 3 status to emergency approval within just a few months, right? So that gives you an example of how quickly something can move if it's deemed safe, I think is the primary endpoint there. A lot of clinical studies had been done on that drug prior, so they knew it was a safe drug, but and it was antiviral, which are typically safe. So I think there's always certain things they have to meet, and I'm not an expert in that area, but absolutely, in my feeling is that if you have a drug that's been proven to be safe in humans and has a chance of blocking something like this, try to get it in humans as quickly as possible, at least in a small scale, to see if there's an effect. That would be my recommendation, but then I'm not in the FDA, so I don't know their issues that come up. But I know it was very difficult for them because there was probably a lot of people writing them saying, we have the next treatment, you know, you should try this. So, yeah.
I think on the whole, the FDA functions very effectively.
Yeah.
Those of us in science and the pharma industry might be critical of the excessive caution. But on the other hand, you know, we have this example, for example, the J&J vaccine, which has an extremely low risk of causing blood clots. And yet the publicity around that is leading to, I think, many people avoiding vaccination because, you know, this concept that vaccines can be harmful and dangerous. People do not understand probabilities. They cannot, take into account the fact that a risk of 1 in a million is a lot different than a risk of 1 in 100 or 1 in 10. And so the trust in the FDA and the whole pharmaceutical process is extremely important for being able to maintain a healthy population.
No, that's very interesting, and I nobody wants to be a guinea pig, and I think that's where some of the hesitation is coming from people who don't want to get the vaccine. But to your point, I think it was only like 6 people out of a few million that got sick with the J&J vaccine, and they halted it. It seems like pretty low probability, and hopefully that can come back online. But nevertheless, they have kept us safe, and I think we're one of the few, clinical, regulatory bodies that everybody trusts to do the right thing. So keeping that trust in that institution, I think, is critical. Well, as it relates to, what I've heard today, what I've learned today from you guys is that the vaccines was great. There's obviously structural things like forced quarantine and lockdowns and masks, social distancing, nutrition supplements. The vaccines are a good bridge to get to herd immunity, but as this virus continues to mutate, we're going to need other tools in the toolkit, and hopefully antivirals and the work you guys are doing will allow the practitioners to find new treatments. What is your outlook, though, on how this continues to play out? Are we going to be in this scenario for the next 12 to 24 months until we get to herd immunity? Or do you think that it's shorter? Is it longer? Is there a reference scenario where this mutates out of control and we have to lock down again? How do you see this playing out given what you guys know?
Well, how long has flu been with us? I guess it's been around since I was a child. I hope that's not the case, but I think that everything I've heard from experts, and Lee and I have talked to several of them, there's a lot of concern over the breakouts in Brazil, the breakouts in India, the variants that could be generated from those types of breakouts. This is going rampant in places like Brazil and India. That's us. That's not just, we don't live in an isolated world. So if you're giving an opportunity for viruses to mutate in large populations, they are likely going to find their way to our soil. So I think that at the end of the day, I'm assuming that these things are not going to go away anytime soon, that they're going to be with us probably for several years. We might need booster shots, et cetera, for like the flu. But because it's not a deadly virus in the sense that it doesn't kill 30, 40% of the population it infects, it always has an opportunity to keep going. So, I'm on the soapbox screaming about let's get some antivirals in place as well, because if I was infected, I would love to be able to take a pill that would protect me from becoming very sick. So I think that's a really important factor here that we need to address. But I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon. That's my feeling. But see who's right. But in the end, this is a serious problem.
Yeah, I think one part of the problem is not scientific and not even government control and things like that. It's people complying with their medications and with what's good. HIV is a great example. We could eliminate HIV completely, but it continues to propagate. And the reason it propagates is because something like 50% of people who have HIV do not comply with appropriate treatment.
That's fascinating. Well, gentlemen, I appreciate your time. This is we call the human factor in season 3, where we ask each of you a question. It can be yes or no. You can provide as much context to the question as you'd like. But I'll kick it off with you, Gennaro, first. Now that we have a vaccine, would you or have you taken it?
I've taken it, yes. I took it a few months ago. I took the Moderna, so, yep.
Dr. Hartwell, how about yourself?
Yeah, I got the Pfizer vaccine as soon as I could.
So what was your number one goal for 2021?
My number one goal for 2021 was to find an oral broad spectrum host-directed antiviral. That's what I've been saying over and over in my brain for the last year. I'm convinced it's possible, and that's my goal for this year, is to get that to fruition.
Dr. Hartwell, how about yourself?
Well, to complement that, I would say in a longer term perspective, to be able to adequately test all of the safe drugs for humans through a system that can categorize them into cellular functions and activities for future diseases would be my hope.
No, that is so important, and it's baffling that it has never been done before. So I commend both of you guys for going down this path. So what was your big achievement, if any, in 2020? Were there any big breakthroughs that you felt you reached in 2020?
For me personally and for the company, I think with the pandemic, and this is not me saying so, we absolutely validated and proved out the platform we had developed for over a decade with a major pharmaceutical company stating that to us. That may not sound like a big deal, but for me, it was an amazing deal because to validate a platform is one of the most difficult things any biotech company can do. Most never get there. So having validation for our platform this year, because of the pandemic, to be honest, was really an exciting event for the company. So our goal now is, as Lee just stated, which I didn't state as the major goal, but he's correct. It's really about taking this platform now and doing the 10,000 approved medications and finding out what else we can learn and what other drugs are out there that we don't know about yet and we can find. So it's been a great year from that perspective, a terrible year from the perspective that a lot of people perished, but yeah.
And it's not just COVID as well. I mean, you're learning things in this categorization, this library that you're creating about probably other diseases, like treating symptoms like, cancer or other types of viruses as well.
Well, you just nailed it. Virus biology is very similar to cancer biology. So some of the drugs we found actually have dual roles in cancer. So we're exploring that, as well as other viruses like flu and MERS and Ebola. So yeah, we're testing all these different viruses, and we're testing cancer models because cancer requires the same things that viruses require. So yes, you're right on the money with that.
Dr. Hartwell, what were your thoughts about any major milestones you hit in 2020?
I think it was, as Gennaro says, the validation of the approach, which for me is from a biology and conceptual perspective, it continues to amaze me the degree of conservation of fundamental aspects of biology, all the way from yeast to humans. I mean, the fact that one can take a very simple organism with only 7,000 genes and continually learn things that are fundamentally important for human disease, I think is just amazing and wonderful.
No, it's helpful to have a baseline to then extrapolate from. So the next question is, and you guys are both thought leaders, but maybe I'll narrow it down to make it easier to answer this question, because you guys are definitely leading human thought in a lot of different areas. Who are thought leaders that you go to learn about, coronavirus and COVID-19? Who are people that you reach out to or you follow their literature?
Well, mine is a more personal thing. I follow a lot of literature, and I found an enormous amount of literature on lipid metabolism and viruses that have been published over the years, which was quite amazing, actually, that people had not really appreciated that. But the people I've been reaching out to recently are individuals that I feel have great experience in these areas. Certainly my colleagues at Gilead. Bill Lee is one of my favorite people, and I interact with him on a regular basis. Other people are Robert Jordan, who works at the Gates Foundation and has previously worked at Gilead. He's an expert virologist who's actually responsible for remdesivir when it was first discovered. Partly, of course, he was part of a team. And then I've been talking to the Jean-Claude Tarif up in Montreal with his partner Guy Boyne from Quebec City. These are amazing virologists, infectious disease experts that I work with. And most recently, Robert introduced me to Jinheng Chang, who's at an institute in the Northeast, who's terrific, and she's passionate about host-directed antivirals as well. So the more you dive into this area, because we found it unbiased, you realize that there's a lot of expert scientists and people that are very passionate and want to drive this forward. And I think I'm building a team now around me that can help me support this and try to get this done. So it's been an exciting year of meeting new people and getting in touch with some of the best people in the world, I think, that know virology. So from that point of view, as a scientist, speaking as a scientist, which I was for many, many years, it's been a really fun ride in terms of what I've learned and the people I'm getting to meet. So this has been great.
One of the most valuable things I think are with all the science that's going on are people you can trust who summarize the results as they're coming out because it's just too much to follow. And this last year, there's a group of students at the University of Washington Public Health Department, which every day put out a summary of the best articles that have appeared and even articles prior to publication on new results about the COVID disease. For me, that's been just an invaluable resource.
Fantastic.
That sounds like fascinating reading, having smart people summarize the takeaways. Bottom line up front, I like it. Well, what are you reading or what are you listening to today? Do you mind sharing with our viewers?
Well, I am actually, I'm kind of busy, so I don't read or too many things I don't follow, but I always pull up the New York Times and CNN and just see what's going on around the world. And then I also am part of a consortium that came out of really just a group effort around the world to bring people together to talk about COVID-19. I try to tune into that every Friday when I can. But really, today, this is a weekend. I'm trying to take a breather for a second and just reflect on all the things that have happened the last couple of weeks. It's been a crazy time, but I like to follow really the Wall Street Journal and New York Times and CNN and any publication. I'm always rooting around for publications on COVID-19 and lipid metabolism, et cetera. So that's how I keep myself sort of informed about what's happening. But bottom line is there's a lot of good people around me that I rely on. Lee is one of them, of course, that always sends me an article or two now and then. And you say it's great to have smart people find great articles for you, but when it's also scrutinized by Lee Hartwell and then he sends me his top, that's a pretty good funnel for me. So that's what I do. But Lee, I'm sure, is more well-read than I am. So I'll let him answer the question.
Well, I'm very interested in science education and how we can train undergraduates for an unpredictable future. And so my major work has been around how can we give students an authentic experience of doing science, of exploring the unknown and asking questions and doing experiments. And so for that, I spend most of my time thinking about human vision and cognition.
Fascinating. And you know, STEM education is so critical for the future of this country. Just maybe to go off topic for a second, what are your thoughts as a country? How far behind are we from where we need to be in terms of STEM education?
That's all yours, Lee.
I think we're in a big transition period where the history and the past of education has been about imparting information. And we're now in an era where information is at our fingertips and we don't know how to deal with it from an educational perspective. And the challenge is to teach students how to think for themselves, ask questions, and go and try and find the answers. And that's a completely different approach and requires students to understand that there are not answers often. And it's not about getting the right answer. It's about being uncomfortable with uncertainty and being able to judge information for evidence. And we're not there yet. We've got a long ways to go in terms of changing educational systems, which have several hundred years of difficulties.
Good word.
That's a whole nother episode we could dive into. Well, I'll tell you, are there any podcasts that you guys listen to besides on Beta Alpha, of course?
For me, only Beta Alpha. That's it. That's the only one I listen to. I've tuned into a few podcasts, but to be perfectly honest with you, this year I've been so busy with running the company. There's nothing much I do other than every day wake up and try to figure out how to move the ball forward. So, but I really am fascinated by podcasts, actually. And when I found out about this one and was exposed to it, it really seemed like a really good way to get messages across to people and get, it's just fantastic. So thank you, for putting these kind of things together, because it's a new age. Both Lee and I don't think know much about podcasts from a few years ago. These are new ways of communicating that are really fascinating. So I'm all for it. I think it's a great vehicle, but I don't actually follow any specific podcast. But maybe I will. Yeah.
Dr. Hartwell?
I don't listen to any podcasts.
We'll send you guys the transcripts and email then. But gentlemen, it's been an honor to have you. I learned a lot. I know our viewers will have learned a lot. And thank you for everything you guys have been doing. No doubt you haven't had time to read books. You've been busy trying to save humanity, so we appreciate it. God bless. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Really appreciate the time. Fantastic.
Okay.